and good evening, everyone from Wellington, from the EU delegation to New Zealand. In this panel, we'll hear from the researchers themselves and to hear about their experience on research cooperation between European countries and Australia and New Zealand. And we will also be talking about the impact of COVID, which has already been touched upon in the first panel. We have 4 panelists for our session. Dr. Katharina Heil, who is the president of the Erasmus Mundus Association, Dr. Mostafa Moonir Shawrav, who is the chair of the Marie Curie Alumni Association. We've got Dr. Michael Bowen, who is the chair of the EMCR Forum in Australia, and Dr. Serenas, who is the co-chair of the ECR Forum here in New Zealand. So we're obviously very keen to hear about the roles of these organizations, but to kick off, I would be curious to hear from each of the panelists about their own experience of mobility as a researcher. How have you benefited from moving abroad for your research, or perhaps receiving colleagues from other countries to work jointly on projects? Could I turn to Katharina to kick us off on that?
Sure. Good morning from Europe. Good afternoon to your part of the world. Thanks a lot, Kevin, for the kind introduction, and I think sharing a little bit of my European or just worldwide experiences on how interacting with others just makes the world a little bit of a smaller place. So I myself, I was born and raised in Germany. I then did my first actual longer research exchange during my bachelor's thesis project, where I got to go to Argentina. I was then very lucky to do my master's abroad as well. Got to do a joint PhD program, which was funded by the European Commission through the Erasmus Mundus grants. That actually allowed me to live and study and work in 2 European universities, but also got me to travel to India, which I think is not just a very different place culture-wise, but also has some different points on how research is done. It really just helped me very much to broaden my horizons. I personally currently live and work in Spain, where I still am involved in research. I moved on to also be more involved in the research management part. So I think really getting those different points of view of how different people, not just only the nationals in the different countries, but also just the very international research environment works in different places, has really just helped me in many ways to do research, to be more efficient, to think about problems from different points of view. And yeah, I can only say how much it brought to me as a person, but also as a researcher, a scientist, and science diplomacy was mentioned before, I think, as well. So those really are all the aspects that make the international experiences really, really worthwhile as for, yeah, in so many aspects.
Thank you, Katharina. Thank you very much for sharing that experience, both on a personal and professional level. And of course, we'll hear more about the work of your organization later on in this session. Could I ask Mostafa to give us his take on doing research in different parts of the world and the value added it has had for you?
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Euraxess, for the invitation. Once again, good morning from Europe. So yes, I'm originally from Bangladesh. Over the past 12 years, I moved quite a lot. I mean, you could say that I'm a true example of III initiative of European Union, so international, interdisciplinary, and intersectoral. So I studied in Netherlands, then I worked in Belgium in a university, and then I did my PhD and 2 postdocs in Austria, and after almost 12 years in academia, I just moved into industry. So this international or mobile research actually helped me a lot. I mean, it taught me personally the effective intercultural communication skills. It helped me think outside the box. I think Katharina already mentioned about, or our earlier speaker mentioned about the other topics. For example, as a researcher, we are quite deep into our research, right? So time to time, we do not have the understanding of what else is going on, maybe from policy perspective, maybe from the current challenges. So as a mobile researcher, because I was involved in different associations, so you go in different culture and you try to understand their challenges. So this helps you to give a perspective, not only on the research, but also a bit outside of the research. So what are the current challenges, for example? And also it helped me actually build an international network of combining from people from almost all parts of the world. So personally and professionally, it helped me a lot.
Thank you very much, Mostafa, for sharing that and making the point that it's not only about going beyond the borders of your country, but also beyond the borders of your topic and your field of study. And of course, the point you mentioned about building an international network of researchers, which is, I think, something we're very much trying to support here. So closer to home here, I'm very keen to hear from Michael and Serenas how they view this, either from your personal experience or having received researchers from Europe here in New Zealand or in Australia, or perhaps Australians and New Zealanders from your institutions that have gone abroad, and what the impact has been. So anything that you would be willing to share, we're very keen to hear. Perhaps can we start with Michael?
Sure. So thanks, Kevin, for the running the session, and thanks to Euraxess for inviting me along to this panel today. It's a pleasure to take part. I guess I've been really fortunate throughout my career to benefit from mobility, firstly as a PhD student and as a postdoc, and now as a group leader at a university, and also chief scientific officer of a biotech company that I co-founded. So as a PhD student and a postdoc, I was fortunate to move over to Germany for an extended period during my PhD, and then again to have several extended research visits over there. And those visits really allowed me to establish some core collaborations and research projects, which gave me my big break in terms of setting up the groundwork for my first independent funding grants, which were successful, and those collaborations which have continued since. Now, as a group leader and with my industry role, I really benefit from having a diverse team and from having access to researchers based overseas and companies based overseas that can provide services that we otherwise wouldn't be able to gain access to here. So I've got researchers in my team who are from or have spent time as postdocs in the UK, US, Europe, New Zealand. And to be able to cast that wide net obviously is great from the perspective of finding the people with the right skill set that you need. But I think it also has more general benefits in that there are these clear and empirically supported benefits from having a diverse research group and the different perspectives that they provide. And that's certainly been my experience.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. That's a very interesting point also from an industry perspective, how mobility as a researcher has then allowed you to build sort of an internationally oriented business as well, which I think would be very interesting for many of our listeners. Serenas, sorry, can I ask you for your take on what mobility of researchers brings for you personally?
So Nusambula Vanaka, my name's Siriana Naipi. I was named after my great-grandmother who raised my mother in the village of Nakinda in Naita City. I guess from that introduction, you can tell that my take on international globalization and mobility is a little bit different. As an Indigenous researcher, I was raised in the Indigenous Academy, and I think internationalization at first, or the sort of global movement at first, kind of feels a bit odd. It feels like we're being pushed away from our whenua, our vanua, or to do research away from our own people. But actually, when I went overseas, it was a really useful experience to have to articulate myself in a space where people have not previously heard of where I am from, have not previously heard of what I do. And it made me a lot stronger. And I think it also gave me the opportunity to network internationally with other Indigenous researchers and create really strong, important bonds for changing spaces and places. So I'm still in touch now with people who've benefited from going overseas as well. There's some amazing decolonization work coming out of Europe. And so getting that opportunity to work in really close spaces with people whose thinking is being influenced in different ways is helping to come through with different solutions. And that I think has been really helpful. I'm a social scientist too, which also makes me a little bit different, I think, from the rest of the crew here. But it has been, I think, having the ability to go overseas and to be in those spaces makes a huge difference. And it's something I value, and I encourage other Indigenous academics who are emerging to do, and to other emerging academics, that this is something that will change your trajectory. That overseas experience in Europe changes what you envision as possible and changes your networks that make it possible.
Thank you very much, Serenas, and thank you for making the point that studying abroad doesn't mean leaving behind your roots, or on the contrary, that you can share and celebrate your origins and your story with researchers from other parts of the world, which is a very valuable part of researchers' mobility as well. Now, I wanted to start on a positive note by hearing all of your stories, because of course we are going to talk about the impact of COVID on mobility of researchers and the work of researchers, which we can only guess has been tricky, with people not being able to move or travel, or having to postpone their projects, or perhaps staying longer in a country than they initially planned in order to carry out their research. So what we would be keen to hear from each of your organizations is how each of your institutions has handled that. Have your researchers been able to carry on their project, either staying longer or having to go back? Has the nature of research cooperation changed, presumably by moving more to a virtual space? And what kind of support have your organizations been able to offer researchers that have been affected? If it's okay, we'll sort of go in the same order and kick off with Katharina.
Sure. Yeah, I think in that sense, I might be the one who's a little bit different. I'm the president of the Erasmus Mundus Students and Alumni Association. So most of our members are still in their postgraduate master's degrees. So yes, they have been affected, even though most of the master's courses did actually start. What does that mean? We've all lived this and experienced it, and traveling has become a lot more challenging. And even though in some areas people would be in the actual city where the university is placed and the course is taking place, classes will still be moving online to just avoid social contact, basically. Nevertheless, there have been many different approaches on how to deal with the situation. I think the beauty of this program really is to have very, very international cohorts with non-Europeans coming to Europe often for the very first time in their lives. And many have still been encouraged to do so. Said that, the fact that education had to move digitally in one way or another, even though traveling wasn't available, immediately all these people could join in. And I think you, Serenas, said something interesting earlier, that we often think about for being international, we need to go somewhere else. But I think often we can also just kind of think about getting the internationality into our homes by just looking a little bit, a little bit further than what we usually do. And I think this is also what the fact that we're learning to use digital means a lot better at the moment, or differently, enables us a lot to still generate those moments where we feel like we are in an international environment, even though we might still all be at home. It does require a lot more effort, but I do feel that many of the, especially course coordinators that are running those international master's degrees, are putting a lot of time and effort into really trying to lift the spirit and to come up with a manner on how to still deliver a course that has that international feeling as well.
So, Katharina, can I just ask a follow-up? So, you're saying that many of the Erasmus Mundus exchanges have, in practice, gone ahead despite
I know
despite
of
the
many,
pandemic, and that.
Yes. I know of many students from overseas that would have received support to obtain a visa, to get to travel. Many of them did quarantine. Sad that this was also over the summer, so I think it is true that now many of those students are in Europe, but are actually staying in the apartments or shared rooms that they found, where they probably already are with at least 2 or 3 of their kind of colleagues or other students. But to the best of my knowledge, most of the students were supported to a large extent to come and travel to Europe. This, I think,
that's excellent.
Yeah, it does vary, I think, if it comes to actual researchers, but I'm going to leave that to the others. From the association point of view that I'm representing, the students, most of them would still be able to come, and obviously are experiencing a very different time here that they would have done 2 years back. But as said before as well, I'm hopeful that things will change at least a little in the coming months to, enable a bit more personal interaction as well.
Thank you, Katharina. I'm sure it has impacted individual researchers in different ways, but it's really reassuring to hear that overall Erasmus Mundus is going ahead, and that people are able to come to
just
Europe.
Maybe then on a side note,
exchange.
Just to not get me wrong, this is for Erasmus Mundus, so that means international, like actually overseas students coming to Europe. What has diminished a lot is the actual exchange within European countries. So the big other part of Erasmus, which is people from Spain moving to Italy or people from the UK going to Germany, that, to be honest, I'm not as well aware of those numbers, but the kind of general feeling that I've gotten, what I kind of know, is that those exchanges have been limited very much.
That's the information I have as well. So I was relieved to hear that that Erasmus Mundus is not sort of entirely on hold due to the pandemic. Perhaps I can jump to Serenas, as we're here in New Zealand, and we are privileged, I would say, to live in relative normality. Our researchers are able to meet face to face. So perhaps I can ask for your take. I mean, we did have a lockdown, of course, but now we enjoy relative normality. But when it comes to, obviously, New Zealanders are advised not to travel at the moment. How has that impacted the researchers that you work with? Have they postponed their plans, or have they found other ways to pursue their international research cooperation?
I think so. And at Royal Society Te Aparangi, our ECR community's had a bit of a shock. We're facing some pretty horrific cuts in our sector, and then for a lot of people who do international work, having to rethink budgets, rethink the ability to go through, particularly the regional Pacific. We had expectations that we'd be able to visit the Cook Islands, Tuvalu and Niue because they're part of our realm, but we're not able to. And then people like myself who had plans, July, gonna spend like a month in Canada and get some work done, not happening. But the flip side of that is moments like this, right? Where normally if we were gonna sit on a panel like this, it would have been a 10-day trip for me as opposed to an hour and a half, 2 hours out. My kids are fed. You might hear them yelling in the background. As a mum, it's weirdly worked for me as an ECR mum. I did Australia yesterday. So I think that this is quite an interesting opportunity, and what's happening is the ECR community is showing their flexibility. So the initial shock meant we had 200 people on a call like this saying, what are we going to do? A lot of our ECRs in Australia were saying, I want to come home, but there's no jobs. What do I do? ECRs located overseas generally. So those of our ECRs in Europe trying to get on planes within 48 hours to get home, and then coming home to nothing, and trying to rebuild, I guess, a life that they hadn't expected to have to rebuild at this point in a really tight job market, has led to quite a bit of innovation. And our role at Te Aparangi has been to support. So we've released papers that outline the ECR concerns. So we've released a COVID-19 working paper, and we're holding sector-wide discussions. We've got another one later this week saying, how can we come together? How can we continue? And I think something that might be off our radar is how do we support that international collaboration from within? Because at the moment, ECRs, I think, are kind of doing their own thing and trying to manage it themselves and trying to make sure they can get enough Zoom time in. And I genuinely think that New Zealanders, we're in a really unique place where we're able to gather with 50 people in a room and Zoom in someone from Germany. Other people don't have that option. So we're lucky. We've got the opportunity to move quickly, but we are having to rethink and be quite nimble about it. It's back to being isolated at the bottom of the world again.
Thank you, Serenas, for sharing that. It's what a lot of people in my work call a hybrid meeting, where you have a group of people in the room, but nevertheless, now that we've gotten so good at using Zoom and doing video conferences, we still have the reflex to see maybe we can bring in somebody on the other side of the world to share their viewpoint on that, which is maybe again one of the silver linings of COVID, that people who wouldn't have done video conferences otherwise are now more willing to join a discussion from another continent. Michael, can I turn to you to tell us a bit about the EMCR Forum, also in order for our listeners to get a better understanding of the support that your forum offers, and how the impact has been on researchers from Australia that were planning to go abroad or still intending to, or that are abroad at the moment, and how COVID has impacted them.
Sure. So the EMCR Forum is a branch of the Australian Academy of Science, and it's the peak body representing early and mid-career researchers in Australia. So we define that as researchers up to 15 years post PhD award date. And the goal of the EMCR Forum is really to be the voice of early and mid-career researchers in Australia. We have over 5,500 members, but we represent all EMCRs in STEM disciplines. So being part of the Australian Academy of Science, we do obviously focus on STEM researchers. And we have a range of different activities covering policy and advocacy, but also career development. So we run workshops, we run a conference every 18 months, which we unfortunately had to postpone, but turned into a series of workshops instead this year, focused specifically on COVID and on the impact of COVID. And we have been fortunate over many, many years to foster relationships with government, with funding bodies, and that gives us access and the ability to, get face-to-face with decision makers, and we've been able to demonstrate impact on a number of occasions through that, and we've really been focusing on that during COVID and trying to leverage those relationships to ensure that we're getting EMCR voices heard and communicating possible solutions that can lessen the impact of this extremely challenging time for EMCRs. So we sort of started off our COVID response in May by conducting a nationwide survey of early and mid-career researchers. And there were obviously a lot of really interesting findings that came out of that that were quite shocking in many instances, just to see the huge impact that it was having. In particular, the demographics that were most affected, for instance, women with caring responsibilities appeared to be most impacted, which is consistent with the results of other surveys. But in terms of mobility, one of the things that was really striking is that around 3/4 of our respondents were on contract, but 57% of them reported that they were really worried about their job security and their future employment prospects in the sector. Now, unfortunately, since we ran that survey, those fears have really been borne out, with around 10% of university staff having lost their jobs during COVID. Now, in the past, a researcher would have had the opportunity to look overseas to seek alternative employment, but that's a lot more challenging with the border closures. So I think the risk now is not just that we lose those researchers to Australian science, but that we risk losing them to science altogether, which is a real tragedy in my view. And we've sort of taken that forward, and at the forum, we've been making a number of policy submissions. We've had meetings with ministers. We've had meetings with the head of funding bodies to inform them of our survey findings, to provide advice and possible solutions, and to offer our assistance to connect them with the EMCRs, basically to do what we can to encourage that there be stopgaps put in place to ensure that we don't lose these researchers. Because if we lose them, you know, it's not just a case of, oh, everything's back to normal in, you know, a year or 18 months time and they'll just come flooding back. If they've moved to other sectors, it takes, you know, 10, 15 years to train another EMCR and replace that position. That's expertise that has a generational impact on a nation. In addition to that sort of advocacy work, we've been running a series of workshops focused on COVID, which are available online, focusing on different aspects of how people can deal with the pandemic and trying to keep their career moving forward during the pandemic. So that was workshops, webinars, panel sessions, and helping people to navigate those really difficult times.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you also for reminding us that, of course, COVID is not only affecting researchers' mobility, but also researchers that are staying in their own country, but that are affected also by the economic repercussions, and universities, of course, more broadly are not receiving international students also here in New Zealand, and that leads to shortages then in other areas as well. Can I turn back to Europe to Mostafa to hear a little bit also whether from the Marie Curie alumni, what has the feedback been in terms of the exchanges? Have they gone ahead? How has this impacted people's experience in Europe? Mostafa, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry. I think, so the impact of Mary Skłodowska-Curie Action researchers are a bit more severe because how this mobility grant actually works. So generally, or broadly speaking, for PhDs or individual fellows, you get the grant and then you do 1 year research and then you go to another year. And for PhDs, you have secondment. So you spend 2 to 3 months in a specific country. So also, the grant is for a very limited period of time. So what happened is that who were PhDs or postdocs or ECRs or early career researchers, they have a severe impact. They could not go to another country, but at the same time, because they have a fixed time, that means even though they are in a lockdown, they could not stop working, right? Because they need to finish the project on a certain period of time. On the other hand, some of them actually has a care responsibility. So it was a very difficult situation. So as an association, we try to give a platform to our researchers. We talked with the Mary Skłodowska-Curie Action as well as the research executive agencies and proposed solutions. We actually also made a survey for the MSCA researchers where we found out that more than half of them are having really severe issues. At the same time, we are collaborating with similar-minded organizations in Europe, like Young Academy of Europe, Eurodoc, where we have seen that the overall situation of the early career researchers are not so good. Fortunately, some of the funding organizations, like in Germany, like in Portugal, they extended the grant with a paid extension, which unfortunately did not happen for the MSCA. And once again, I mean, it's a bit a dilemma because we always say that the MSCA researchers are the excellent researchers due to the success rate and the applications. And now they are the one who will have severe impact of COVID, not only currently, but also in their future career, because that means this is normally a way to your individual position. If you have an individual fellowship, then the next step is you get a permanent position somewhere. But because now look at the scenario, there are the national funded researchers whose grant was extended, they could finish on time. On the other hand, the MSCA researcher, unfortunately, will not be able to finish on time, or will not be able to provide satisfactory results. So this will have a serious impact, not only their career as a researcher in future, but also we have seen that a lot of researchers are getting discouraged to pursue a future research career. So this is kind of a broader impact, a negative impact. And as an association, we have a unique, I would say, member base, because we have members in 143 countries in the world, and currently we have over 17,000 members. And so this gives us an opportunity to understand what is happening in different countries, what are the rules and regulations, how countries are trying to help the researchers, I mean, depending on the funding organization, of course. Now, I think we are in extreme situation.
Mostafa, I think we're not hearing you.
So yeah. I think you can hear. Okay. So what I was talking is basically this is an extreme situation, and this extreme situation warrants extreme measures. So I hope that the funding organizations, including MSCA and others, will understand that, even the prestigious European Research Council grantee. So this should be taken care by the funding organization.